Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. My name is Sebastian Moore.
And I'm hilary.salt.
And we're doing our news section today.
That's right.
And we've got a couple of items. So I want to talk a little bit about wealth tax, because it's been suggested by a few Labour politicians.
Which is one of the topics I would generally talk about, isn't it?
I know, I feel like
we've kind of swapped.
Right, and you're going to talk about something that's a little bit more international.
I'm going to talk about the Romanian elections.
I feel like we have swapped this week, haven't we?
Yeah. Let's see if we're any better.
Yeah. It's like an away day. So the Romania elections.
Yes.
This is something that I mentioned when I spoke about JD Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference.
That's right.
He used this as an example of illiberal democracy because the Romania elections were cancelled last year. So
yes.
I know you wanted to talk about it. So tell us.
Yeah, so setting the scene, let's just remember what happened last year. So November last year, it's a kind of two-part election. So you have a first round, then some people are eliminated, then there's a second round. And in the election last year, in November last year, the kind of quite odd candidate, I would say. I mean, that's not a reason to exclude somebody from an election, but he is a bit odd. We'll talk about that in a minute. But his name is Georgescu, Călin Georgescu. He kind of won fairly convincingly the first round. And he is a bit odd. So he's a kind of Trump and Putin supporter. He's also kind of lined up behind some of the previous fascist leaders of Romania. One of his associates was found with, I think, £24 billion in gold bullion or something like that. That sounds too much, doesn't it? Maybe it's £24 weight in gold bullion. Anyway, a lot of money and grenades and...
when you say grenades, what do you mean grenades?
Like little
he was
bombs.
found with grenades?
Yeah. This is his associate, not him.
Yeah.
And ammunition and all kinds of things.
That's not suspicious, is it? Grenades, gold bullion. It sounds like a Bond villain.
It does sound very much like a Bond villain. Yeah. So, I don't want anybody to get the idea that I think this guy is, Georgescu is great, but I think the point we wanted to talk about was the democracy principle, didn't we? So the reason he was excluded from the election, or they pulled the election last year after he won this first round, was because allegedly there'd been a lot of Russian interference in the election, primarily through TikTok, which, as you know, I'm not very familiar with. But there was clearly a lot of social media traffic, and that whole momentum was definitely part of what was behind his campaign. And there was an investigation by the kind of Secret Service equivalent there, who pointed to the fact that they felt there was all this foreign interference, and that led to the election then being declared null. Now, I think they have since had another commission internally in Romania to look into whether that was right. And that's been actually quite critical. And one of the points they made is that you shouldn't base a decision to ditch an election just on the basis of information from your Secret Service, because it kind of doesn't look good, does it? But anyway, that's where we are. So that's where we got to last year. Now, they have scheduled the elections to run again. So during May, I think it's May the 4th and May the 18th, the first and second rounds of the election. And they have now decided that they will not allow Georgescu to stand in the new running of the elections. They've also banned another similar. Obviously the press uses the term far right all the time, don't they? And don't always feel confident using that word because people use it to mean all kinds of things, don't they?
And the problem is that overuse of that word now means that when there is an actual far right candidate, it's boy who cried wolf.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, there is another far right candidate, Diana. Right, you might have to help me with the pronunciation.
I think it's Sosoacha.
Sosoacha, thank you.
I did live in Romania for a little bit, but my Romanian isn't that great, so I think it's Sosoacha.
Yeah, it's better than mine.
Okay.
So she's a kind of independent. She'd set up this SOS Romania party, so that kind of plays on her
SOS
name.
Romania,
Yeah. I know she has now also been ruled as not being able to stand in the election.
Yeah.
Again, with all kinds of allegations that she's been anti-democratic, perhaps some Russian links again. So it kind of feels that it's like that importance of being earnest phrase, isn't it? To lose one parent is unfortunate, but to lose two looks careless. And to ban one election candidate, definitely, that maybe looks unfortunate, but to ban two starts to look significantly undemocratic, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is a real worry. It's likely. Everybody seems to think that it's likely that the kind of centrist mayor, whose name is something Dan, it's likely that he will win the election. But when you've won because many of your candidates have been excluded, that doesn't start to feel like a very significant victory, does it? And I suppose the other thing to say is that it's a bit like here where you get all these, criticisms of populist parties, that often when people are criticising the populist parties, they're really criticising the population. It's the voters they've got a problem with. And in Romania, for the past, I think for the past 3 years, there's been a coalition government of, their equivalent of the leftish and rightish parties. And previously, they've kind of swapped much in the same way that we do in the UK. And I actually think that a lot of the issue there is likely to be much the same as it is here. That people are just fed up of a uni party, and they do want something different. Now, it would be nice if something better that was different was on offer, but it doesn't really seem like it is. And so I do think that perhaps their vote last year and where they might end up this year will be a bit of a howl of protest rather than necessarily a massive swell of support for some of the things that these candidates believe in.
Yeah.
But the worst thing I think you can do about that is to start attacking democracy, because that will just make everybody's conspiracy theories look worse.
Yeah.
I think some of these candidates are kind of anti-vax, anti-bottled water. Interestingly, that's not one I'd heard of. That's a new one on me. So it feels like the kind of reaction that the establishment are taking is just going to make things worse.
Yes, and you can ban one candidate, but another will come along.
Yeah.
And we've got this George Simeon. I think
Yes,
his name
that's
is,
right. Yes.
Who's said that he will put himself forward and he will drop out if there's another candidate.
Correct.
And they will sort of decide between them.
Yes.
One of the reasons you can have quite a few candidates is because it uses this 2-round voting system, which is, I think, the most common voting system on the planet. So many countries use it, like France's presidential election, where you can vote for any candidate you want in the first round, and then the top 2 go through to the second round.
Yeah.
And it means that then you've got a choice of, you sort of have to group behind the one that you want. And the winners, let's say, the candidates that would have gone through to the second round last time were this Georgescu, who's far right according to the BBC, and Elena Lasconi. It might be Lascon, I think you don't pronounce the I on the end, but who's sort of centre left or quite a centrist candidate. Romania is a really interesting country politically because I think, when you made this point of showing similarities between Romania and, plenty of other countries are kind of going through similar things.
Yeah.
The difference is the historical background to it. And Romania has this history where they had a dictator until 1989, Nicolae Ceausescu.
How are you pronouncing that?
Ceausescu.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I'm not sure that was a popular pronunciation in the UK.
Was it not?
Ceausescu, I think we would have said.
Ceausescu.
Yeah,
maybe.
Maybe that's just Bolton. I don't know.
He was a really authoritarian leader who was executed, I think Christmas Day 1989. And I mean, you can see his legacy in Romania. I lived in Bucharest for a while, and the heaviest building in the world is in Bucharest.
Is it?
The Palatul Parlamentului, I think it's called, the parliamentary palace. It's absolutely enormous. Only bigger in size by the Pentagon. Wow. But in terms of weight, I believe it's the heaviest in the world. And I would go on runs all the way around it, like 5K runs round this building. It's just enormous.
Why is it so heavy?
Just a lot of concrete, I think they used. But so now Romania is in this place where it's since 1989, it's got much closer to Europe.
Yep.
Because before then it was on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And now it feels like a country with, and I remember saying this to a few people, a few locals over there, and I'm not sure if they really agreed, but it felt to me like it's a country without a clear sense of identity, because their identity's been challenged so much from what has happened historically. And now they're embedded within the EU. They've just joined the Schengen zone. And it's kind of, there's a lot of EU facing or EU orientation, but I don't feel like they've really crafted a sense of identity.
Certainly Georgescu was very anti-EU and anti-NATO as well.
Yeah, so I think the people that are susceptible to that are the ones that sort of pushing back against this idea of just our only policy is to get closer and closer to the EU.
So perhaps being a bit more believers in the nation state and sovereignty.
Yes, yeah. But of course, if the only candidate that's campaigning for that is far right, then that is the person that people will get behind.
Yep.
And I'm no fan of far right candidates, but we need to have genuine political representation so that people's views can actually be represented by people.
Yeah, I mean, just because you wouldn't want anybody to snip that quote, Sebastian, I'm not sure I'd ever say I'm not in favour of far-right candidates, but I would maybe say, I'm not in favour of far-right candidates. We need a proper democratic choice.
I think 5-10 years ago, you're right, that sentence is more dangerous. But nowadays, it's like if everybody's far right according to the BBC, then it's hard to even know what terminology to use.
It is, absolutely. Yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, so keep an eye on the Romania presidential elections.
Watch this space, I think yes.
4th of May, is it?
4th of May, the first round, yeah.
Yeah, and as JD Vance says, if your election can be bought off by a few $100,000 from a foreign country, then how strong was your democracy in the first place?
Indeed, absolutely.
Yeah, although I got a lot of stick for praising JD Vance.
Yeah. He kind of blotted his copybook thereafter, didn't he? So anyway.
Let's move on, shall we?
Let's move on. So you want to talk about a wealth tax. So you're doing...
I mean, this is relevant because Liz Kendall yesterday, as we're recording, it was yesterday, she approached Parliament with her plans for the cuts to disability benefits. Now, that's angered a lot of people on the left of the Labour Party. And I know we've spoken, you did a piece on sickness benefits, 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. So go and check out that episode if you want to hear more about that. But I think a few people on the left of the Labour Party, Diane Abbott, Richard Bergen, Zara Sultana, they've come out and said, rather than cutting disability benefits, let's put a wealth tax in place instead. And this is a popular idea from the left of the political spectrum. Often the Green Party advocate a wealth tax. So I thought it might be interesting just to look at a wealth tax. So it's something that, basically a wealth tax is a tax on assets rather than on income. So the majority of our taxation in the UK comes from income tax. This would be a tax on your assets. Yeah. And countries that have used this have varied in terms of what they've taxed. One of the difficulties is to actually assess how much wealth somebody has. And you made this point yesterday when we were talking about it, of how do you value, people's artwork in their houses, and rich people are very good at putting their money into things that can't necessarily be taxed.
Yeah.
So the reason that people advocate a wealth tax is because wealth inequality is growing. So since 2008, when there was the great financial crash, the income of the wealthiest has increased and wealth inequality has increased. And people would sort of quite rightly look at that and say there's a problem here, that gap is increasing. So let me just get this graph up. So wealth inequality in the OECD, the OECD stands for
Organisation of Economic and...
I was coming to you because I don't know. And I was
okay.
But it's an organisation of developed economies, right? So EU countries, including UK, America, Australia, etc. And I thought it'd be interesting just to explain this wealth inequality, because one thing that I think is bad in our system is to actually visualize data. So I'd be a big fan of getting a much better system for visualizing these things. But I did find some statistics on it, and they're a little bit out of date, but I think relevant to the point. So what's the worst country in terms of wealth inequality in the OECD?
Switzerland?
No, Switzerland is not actually... I don't think Switzerland's that bad. It's US is the worst.
I just thought because lots of millionaires who hide their money in Switzerland. That's what I was thinking.
So the US, the top 1% of people in America, top 1% wealthiest, have how much of a proportion of the wealth?
30?
40%.
I was going to say 45, and I thought that's too much.
But that is quite astonishing. And I think often certainly with stats is people can misinterpret stats. So the top 1% should have more than 1% of the wealth.
Yes.
Right? I think we can all be certain of that, because it would be silly if it's 1%, right? But 1% having 40% of the wealth is huge. Yes. Massive disparity. 1% of people owning almost half the wealth of the country. UK is 23%, so the top 1% own 23% of the wealth. The top 10% own 52% of the wealth. So it's sort of a good way of representing it. If you can imagine, that's one to keep in your head. It's like top 10% own over half of the wealth of the country.
Yep.
So the advocates of a wealth tax say, let's tax that wealth. And we'll so Elizabeth Warren, who was a Democratic candidate in 2020, she advocated this. She said, let's tax 2% on, I think it was wealth over 100 million. So
every year?
Every year, yeah. And this varies from country to country, because many places have tried it. So generally, it will be a yearly tax. So you can say, right, how much wealth do you have? And we're going to take 2% of that this year, and then we'll take 2% of that the next year. One of the arguments from people that are skeptical of this is that you're taxing the same money. So not only is this being taxed already on income tax and capital gains and everything, so you're taxing the same money, but then you're taxing it again the next year. So you're constantly chipping away at it. There were 12 OECD countries that had a wealth tax back in, I think, 20 years ago or so. Now there are only 5, I believe. So countries that still have a wealth tax: Spain, Switzerland, Norway. So there are still wealth taxes out there. So Norway is as an example of this. They have a wealth tax of it's kind of separate, but when you combine the various forms of taxation that they have, it accounts to about 1.1% of wealth. Now, this was increased under the last government, and it actually caused quite a few people to leave the country, which was a concern to the Norwegian government. Now, their response to that was generally, don't leave the country, you're abandoning your country. And there was I think the most famous person in Norway, I might be wrong on that, one of the wealthiest actually moved to Switzerland, which has a wealth tax, but it's just less stringent than the Norwegian one. Which I think kind of raises an interesting point, because generally what you have in this argument is you have those that on the left that say the wealthy are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. We need to just take off a little bit of the wealth of the rich and give it to the poor. And I'm in favour of redistributive policies. The people on the other side of it say people will just leave the country, right? And I think there's actually truth in both. And as usual, it's very hard to find a middle ground because you've got somebody on this side shouting one thing and somebody on the other. So I would say I'm not in favour of a wealth tax because I think it doesn't actually work very well. So the countries that have tried it have projected a certain amount of wealth that it would bring in, and generally it doesn't bring in the amount of wealth they expect.
Yeah.
You also find that people leave the country, like this Norwegian billionaire. However, what was interesting from that story is that he then went to Switzerland, and his point, and he actually gave an interview where he said, taxes in Switzerland aren't the lowest, and there would be other places I could go to, but all things considered, I'm kind of happy to go here. So I think there is a middle ground where people are willing to pay more in tax as long as it's clear, as long as it's not over what they think would be reasonable, and if they're buying into it. And I think this is the big point and where our politics struggles at the moment, is that we've stopped making the argument for taxation.
Yeah.
We've got a Labour Party that has given up this argument of why taxes are important.
Yeah. Can I perhaps raise a couple of challenges?
Absolutely.
So first of all, I think there's an argument to be made that says we have got a wealth tax. Mm-hmm. So we've got a few taxes that I think you could call wealth taxes. They don't have that label in the UK. One is stamp duty on buying a property.
Just explain stamp duty for us.
So when you buy a property, you are taxed on a percentage of the value of the property that you buy. And it's different rates depending on whether it's your first home or a second home, or it's I think buy to let is a higher level of stamp duty as well. But effectively, anybody who has the assets available to buy a property pays a wealth tax when they buy a property, on their first purchase of a property, and if they move up the property ladder, on their second purchase of a property. And effectively, you do pay that wealth tax, not every year, but I don't know how often people move, but every so often there's that. There's also, to some extent, I think, VAT. Now, I know you said that we pay most of our tax on income, but we also pay quite a lot of tax on spending. And people who have more spend more. And sometimes VAT it's argued that VAT is a tax on the poor, because they use more of their income to spend because they can't save it. But I think you can equally argue it's a bit of a tax on the rich, because the rich do buy more. The kind of trick to that is that if you're going to buy a super yacht, which would be vatable in the UK, you don't buy it in the UK. You go and buy it somewhere else. If you ever want to buy a super yacht, remember that tip.
I haven't been shopping for a super yacht recently.
So there's those two taxes. There's also inheritance tax. Now, almost everybody hates inheritance tax. I quite like it. And I think, just again, the thought experiment is, if we really believe in equality of opportunity for everybody, we should have 100% 100% inheritance tax. So that, when you die, your children, your family, they're exactly the same as everybody else in society. They don't have all your assets.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think we should do that, but I do
Why
think...
not?
Because I think it would... It would be a kind of tax on aspiration, wouldn't it? To say that, you shouldn't work hard to provide for your family after your death. And I think people do want to do that.
I don't have kids, but I hope to one day. And I don't want to hand over a lot of wealth to my kids. But I do want the choice to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And there is a part of me that says, if we had 100% inheritance tax, you'd be treating everybody very individualistically. So it's like, you'd say, right, you are an individual and your wealth does not get passed to your offspring. Whereas I see it as more of like the family unit. I think that wealth is part of that family. So I don't know, we've had this conversation before about inheritance tax. I've gone away and really thought about it, and I don't know, it's a difficult one.
Yeah, and that perhaps leads on to my other point, because I think if you're super, super, super rich, you can give all your money away to your children before you die, and therefore you don't pay inheritance tax.
Yeah.
So, in order to stop that, I would, and actually to some extent, there is a wealth tax, because if you give your money away and you die within 7 years, there's a kind of sliding scale where they do pay some tax. So again, that's another example of why I'd argue we do have a wealth tax. But I think one of the problems with both the wealth tax and inheritance tax is that the only people who will pay it will be middle class people.
Yeah.
So the super rich will, as you say, they can go to another country, or they can set up a trust fund, or they can do, financial engineering is clever enough to get around some of these things. And so the very rich don't pay it. The very poor don't pay it because, it doesn't apply to them. You generally have a threshold below which you don't pay a wealth tax. So the only people who would pay it are those, Theresa May calls them the just about managing people, didn't she? The kind of in-between people. I don't agree with a lot of things Theresa May said, but I did think that was a good phrase. So I kind of worry that the problem with the wealth tax would be that the wrong people would pay it. And you've suggested that, there are quite a lot of practical problems. So, if you're going to say anybody who owns more than £500,000 pays a wealth tax. So somebody who's got assets has to go away, value their house, we talked about art before, didn't we? Which are difficult to put a number on. Everybody will tell you that a house is not worth anything until you sell it. What are your investments worth? And they're worth one thing today and they're worth another thing tomorrow. And so there's quite a lot of kind of administration and bureaucracy behind doing that. And if that's going to apply to a big chunk of the population, that's a lot of cost associated with doing that. The nice thing about income tax is that you kind of get it as people earn it, and that's why it's quite a relatively easy tax to administer. Whereas something like a wealth tax would, I think, be quite tricky to administer.
Yes, and I think you're right, and I think that the core of this is that what we're discussing here, I think you and I both agree on this, and tell me if I'm wrong, but we agree that wealth inequality is a big problem, and that our current system doesn't really account for that. And it's actually an argument, if you think of the typical sort of left-right spectrum, it's an argument that the left have on their side.
Yes.
Right? They don't exploit enough because they should be talking about this all the time. And it's why that politicians like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn have gained a massive following. It's because they actually talk about the things that the economic inequality that matters to so many people. Now, I think there must be a better way than a wealth tax, because I do worry that I'm trying to remember the country. There was one country that actually got rid of it and cited the fact that it cost so much to administer because it was so difficult.
Yeah.
And I do think there must be a better way of fairly taxing people and making sure that we're distributing wealth more evenly whilst encouraging aspiration and encouraging people to... I think this should be a country where people want to invest and want to come just as much as making sure that it's fair economically.
I agree, yeah. And I do think more exploration of taxes on spending is worth doing.
Yeah. Well, we can revisit tax,
yeah,
as I'm sure we will.
It's always one of my favourites, as you know.
But it's, it sounds dry, but then when you get into it, you realise that this is a massive thing politically for a political party to really get to grips with. I think we could talk about capital gains in a future episode for sure. Yeah.
I mean, maybe just to note in passing that you said it's a good argument on the left that you want to redistribute income, but certainly the rise in national insurance contributions allegedly on employers, but it always affects employees. That was actually a tax rate on the lower paid, because it much reduced the threshold at which employers start to pay NI. So, if redistribution is part of the government's aims, it feels like that was a bit of an own goal, really.
Right. Yeah. And I'll also add as a little addition is that there is an argument from the advocates of this policy that it's not as easy. Things get mentioned quite simplistically, the idea of rich people just leaving the country. But of course, they have their assets here. So things like property, the majority of their wealth will be in property most likely.
Yeah.
And they can't just take their house when they move with them, so they'd have to sell it.
Yes.
So it is complex.
Yeah. I mean, that argument about being asset rich and income poor.
Yeah.
It clearly, in practical terms, it's right. But if you're you've got to be careful with your words, haven't you? But if you're an older person, somebody my age even, still living in a 5-bedroom family home and saying, well, I haven't got the income to pay that tax, you should be selling up and moving to somewhere smaller, shouldn't you?
Maybe, yeah. And a lot of the people that like this idea of the wealth tax would say that it's not on that person. They're talking about taxing people with £100 million. They're not talking about taxing people with £1 million in assets.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, one to keep an eye on.
Yeah,
it'd be interesting to see what Labour do to see if they can get this bill passed.
Yes.
Without the rebels that will be voting against it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, all good. Well, thank you for listening. Do go and like, share, and subscribe. I don't know if I get those words right, but
I think you do. Yeah, I think that's right.
And if you've got a question or if you've got anything to say on the issue of a wealth tax or on Romanian elections, if we've got any Romanian listeners, please do get in touch. Our email addresses are in the show notes.
We'll see you next time.